A poor man walked into the richest hotel in Chicago. Everyone laughed at him. Nobody knew he had just been invited by the one man in that building who could ruin them all. By the end of today, some of these people will wish they had never opened their mouths. Stay with me, because what happens next will change the way you look at every stranger you meet. His name was Daniel Carter. 34 years old. No family that anyone knew of. No job that anyone respected. Just a man in a worn brown jacket who carried more patience than anyone in that hotel could imagine. Across the lobby stood Richard Blake, a real estate developer who wore his money the way other men wore cologne, thick, loud, impossible to ignore. And somewhere above them, in a private suite on the top floor, an old man named Thomas Harrison was about to make a decision that would turn Daniel's entire life upside down. This is their story. The rain had been falling over downtown Chicago for nearly an hour, the kind of steady, cold rain that soaks through fabric and settles into bone. Streetlights blurred into streaks of gold on the wet pavement, and taxis hissed past one after another, throwing up sheets of water onto the sidewalk. Inside the lobby of the Ashford Grand, the tallest, most expensive hotel in the city, everything was warm, dry, and glowing. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling 3 stories high. A pianist played something slow and elegant near the far wall. Marble floors reflected the light so perfectly that guests sometimes forgot to look up, because looking down was just as beautiful. It was, in every sense, a place built for people who never had to think about money. And that was exactly why, when the glass doors swung open and a man in an old, faded brown jacket stepped inside, the entire room seemed to pause for a breath. His clothes were old. Not stylishly old, genuinely worn. His shoes had been resoled at least once, maybe twice. Water dripped from the hem of his jacket onto the polished floor, and he made no attempt to hide it, no attempt to apologize for it. He simply stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the light, the way a man does when he has just walked out of a storm and into somewhere unfamiliar. A receptionist behind the front desk noticed him first. Her smile, practiced and automatic, faltered slightly. Her eyes moved from his face to his jacket to his shoes, and something in her posture shifted, not open hostility, just a quiet, careful wariness. A few feet away, a well-dressed couple leaned toward each other. The woman whispered something behind her hand. Her husband glanced over his shoulder, then looked away just as quickly, as if being seen looking might somehow make him responsible for what he'd noticed. Near the elevators, a young businessman in a sharp gray suit let out a short laugh under his breath. He didn't bother lowering his voice much. "Wrong building, buddy," he muttered to the man standing beside him, who chuckled in response. Daniel heard it. He heard all of it, actually, every whisper, every stifled laugh, every judgment passed in half a second based on nothing but the fabric he happened to be wearing. He had heard it before, more times than he could count, in more places than he cared to remember. Grocery stores. Bus stops. Job interviews that ended before they began. He lowered his eyes for just a moment, not in shame, but the way a person does when they're choosing, deliberately, not to let something land. Then he lifted his chin and kept walking. He wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to steal. He had been invited. And whatever these strangers thought of him in the next 60 seconds would not change a single fact about who he was or why he had come. He reached the front desk and stood there, water still dripping quietly from his sleeve. "I'm here to meet Mr. Harrison," he said. His voice was calm, even polite, with none of the defensiveness a man might reach for after being stared at like an intruder. The receptionist's eyes narrowed, just slightly, as she looked him over one more time. "Mr. Harrison," she repeated, the skepticism in her voice not even slightly disguised. "Yes. Are you sure you're at the right hotel, sir?" She said the word sir the way some people say a word in a language they don't quite trust. Daniel nodded once, simply. "I'm sure." He didn't explain further. He didn't feel the need to. Whatever was about to happen would explain itself soon enough, and some part of him, a tired, patient part that had learned to wait, already knew that. Before the receptionist could press further, a voice rang out from behind him, loud enough to turn a few more heads in the lobby. "Well. This is interesting." Daniel turned around slowly. A tall man in a tailored black suit stood a few feet away, flanked by two friends who looked like they'd been waiting all evening for something entertaining to happen. His hair was perfectly combed, his watch expensive enough to be its own conversation piece, and his smile carried the particular confidence of a man who had never once been afraid of a room. His name was Richard Blake. One of Chicago's most successful real estate developers, a man whose name appeared on building plaques and charity galas and the occasional glossy magazine cover. He recognized Daniel almost instantly, and something like delighted disbelief crossed his face. "You actually came?" Richard said, letting out a short laugh that echoed slightly off the marble floor. Daniel remained still, his expression unreadable. "I was invited." Richard's smile widened. "Of course you were." He turned briefly toward his friends, inviting them into the joke with nothing more than a glance, and they laughed on cue, the way people do when they want to seem like they're in on something even if they don't fully understand what it is. Richard stepped closer, close enough that Daniel could smell the expensive cologne layered under something colder, the particular scent of a man who had built a life around never being questioned. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice dropping into something almost nostalgic, almost fond, if not for the edge underneath it. "I remember you. From the construction site, years back. You were always asking for extra hours." He tilted his head slightly. "Because you needed the money." Daniel said nothing. He simply looked at Richard, steady and quiet, the way a person looks at whether they've already decided not to let ruin their day. Richard glanced down at Daniel's worn shoes, and something almost like pity, the performative kind, the kind meant to be seen rather than felt, crossed his face. "Some people never move forward," he said. The receptionist smiled nervously, caught somewhere between the two men, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Daniel held Richard's gaze for a long moment. Then, quietly, without a trace of anger in his voice, he said, "You're right. Some people don't." Richard laughed again, louder this time, clearly enjoying himself, clearly assuming he'd won something. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the elevator doors were about to open behind him, and everything about this moment, every laugh, every whisper, every careless word, was about to matter a great deal more than any of them could have guessed. The soft chime of the elevator rang out. The doors slid open. And the entire lobby, as if pulled by some invisible current, went quiet. An elderly man stepped out. He moved slowly but with unmistakable purpose, dressed in a simple charcoal suit that somehow commanded more respect than anything else in the room, not because it was flashy, but because everyone in that lobby seemed to know exactly who was wearing it. It was Thomas Harrison, one of the wealthiest investors in the state of Illinois. A man whose decisions could move markets, whose signature could build or dissolve entire companies, whose presence in a room tended to rearrange the priorities of everyone standing in it. He walked directly toward Daniel, weaving past the stunned receptionist, past Richard's two friends, who had gone very still very quickly, past Richard himself, who had stopped laughing the moment the elevator doors opened. "Mr. Carter," Thomas said, his voice warm in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced. Daniel extended his hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. "Good to see you again," Thomas added, a small, knowing smile at the corner of his mouth. Richard's expression cracked, just slightly, the confident smile faltering like a light flickering before it goes out entirely. "Wait," he said, glancing between the two men. "You know him?" Thomas turned toward Richard, his gaze calm, unbothered, almost curious. "I know him very well." He said nothing else, no explanation, no elaboration, and somehow that made it worse for Richard than any insult could have. Whatever was happening here, whatever history connected the man in the worn jacket to one of the most powerful investors in Illinois, it was clearly something far bigger than a construction site or a pair of old shoes. Thomas turned to the receptionist, who straightened instantly. "Please prepare the private conference room," he said. "Yes, sir. Right away." She was already reaching for the phone before he finished the sentence. Richard stood frozen, watching as Thomas Harrison placed a hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder and guided him toward the elevator. His mind was racing, trying to piece together a version of events that made sense, and finding none. The man he had mocked less than 2 minutes ago, the man in the shoes, the man who never moved forward, was walking into a private meeting with Thomas Harrison as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Daniel didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had felt the shift in the room the moment Thomas said his name, felt the silence spread outward like ripples on still water, felt every pair of eyes that had dismissed him 30 seconds earlier suddenly reconsidering everything they thought they knew. But he wasn't thinking about Richard anymore. He wasn't thinking about the whispers, or the laughter, or the receptionist's nervous smile. As the elevator doors closed and the lobby disappeared behind gleaming steel, Daniel's mind had already gone somewhere else entirely, back to a small, quiet apartment years ago, back to a phone call he had never expected to receive, back to a letter with his father's handwriting on it that he still hadn't found the courage to fully read. Whatever was waiting for him in that conference room, he had the strange, settling feeling that his life was about to split cleanly into 2 halves. The one before this elevator ride, and the one after it. The doors opened on the top floor. And Thomas Harrison said the words that would change everything. "Daniel," he said quietly, stepping out into the hallway, "there's something about your father I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago. An old letter. A hidden fortune. And one final lesson from a father who never stopped watching over his son, even after he was gone." What Daniel Carter learns in the next few minutes will not just change his life. It will change the way he sees every person he has ever looked down on, and every person who has ever looked down on him. This is where the story becomes something more than money. Stay close, because the real twist isn't the fortune. It's what Daniel decides to do with it. The hallway on the top floor of the Ashford Grand was quiet, almost unsettlingly so, compared to the noise Daniel had just left behind in the lobby. Soft lighting glowed along the walls. Thick carpet swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Thomas Harrison walked a step ahead, his pace slow but sure, the pace of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind more than once. They stopped in front of a set of double doors. Thomas pushed them open, revealing a private conference room with a long table, a wall of rain-streaked windows overlooking the glittering city below, and, at the center of the table, a single thick folder. "Sit down, Daniel," Thomas said gently, closing the door behind them. Daniel lowered himself into a chair, water still faintly dripping from his jacket onto the polished floor. He felt out of place here, in this room built for men who signed contracts worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But he had felt out of place in most rooms his whole life, and he had learned, slowly and painfully, how to sit still inside that feeling instead of running from it. Thomas sat across from him and placed both hands flat on the table, as if steadying himself before saying something that mattered. "Your father's estate has finally been settled," he said. Daniel blinked. "My father's?" "Yes." For a moment, Daniel simply stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence, waiting for some detail that would make this make sense. His father had died 11 years ago, quietly, without fanfare, in a small apartment on the south side of the city. Daniel remembered the funeral. 6 people had come. He remembered thinking, at the time, that his father had lived a small life and left even less behind. "I don't understand," Daniel said slowly. "My father didn't have an estate. He barely had savings." Thomas's expression softened, the way a person's does when they are about to correct a belief someone has carried, unquestioned, for over a decade. "That's what he wanted you to believe," Thomas said. "For your own protection. And, I think, for your own growth. He slid the folder across the table. Daniel opened it slowly, his hands steadier than his racing thoughts. Inside were documents. Investment records, company filings, bank statements, page after page of numbers that didn't seem to belong to the man Daniel remembered. The man who had worn the same coat for 15 winters. The man who had taught Daniel to fix a leaking faucet because calling a plumber cost too much. The man who had apologized, more than once, for not being able to give his son more. Your father built an investment company almost 30 years ago, Thomas explained. Quietly. Carefully. He started with almost nothing, and he grew it, piece by piece, over decades, never spending on himself, never letting anyone know what he was building. I was one of the very few people he trusted with the truth. He asked me, years ago, to make sure that if anything ever happened to him, the company would remain protected until the time was right to bring it to you. Daniel's eyes moved across the numbers on the page in front of him, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt slightly. The estimated value of the estate, Thomas said quietly, is a little over $480 million. Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak. Somewhere outside the wall of windows, thunder rolled softly over the city, and rain continued to streak down the glass in long, silver lines. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Instead, sitting in that quiet room with a fortune spread out in front of him on paper, Daniel found himself thinking of something else entirely, of every night he had gone to bed with an empty stomach and told himself it was temporary. Of every job application that had gone unanswered, every landlord who had looked at his clothes before looking at his face, every person, like Richard downstairs, who had decided who he was based on nothing more than a worn jacket and a pair of old shoes. He thought of his father, working late into the night at a job that paid barely enough to keep the lights on, coming home exhausted, never once mentioning the empire he was quietly building in the shadows. Never once letting his son believe, even for a moment, that money could have made their life easier sooner. Why didn't he tell me? Daniel finally asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. Because he wanted you to know what it felt like to struggle before you ever knew what it felt like to have everything. He told me once, and I've never forgotten it, that money reveals character. It doesn't build it. He wanted you to build yours first. Daniel looked down at the folder again, at the neat rows of numbers that represented more wealth than he had ever imagined touching in his lifetime. And slowly, in the quiet of that room, a memory rose to the surface. His father's voice, weak and tired near the very end, gripping Daniel's hand and speaking words that, at the time, Daniel had assumed were simply the rambling comfort of a dying man. Son, never judge people by what they have today. One day, you'll understand why. He understood now. He understood completely. Daniel closed the folder gently, the way a person closes a book they are not yet ready to put down for good. What happens now? He asked. Thomas smiled, not the polite, professional smile Daniel had seen him offer to countless investors and partners over the years, but something warmer, something almost fatherly. Now, Mr. Carter, he said, you decide what kind of man you want to become. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the window of the small apartment he had lived in for the past 4 years, watching the rain finally taper off into a fine mist over the city, and he thought about everything. The fortune, the folder, the years of struggle that suddenly looked different in hindsight, not erased, but somehow purposeful, like every hard year had been quietly shaping him for a decision he hadn't known was coming. He thought about Richard's laugh in the lobby. About the receptionist's nervous, careful smile. About the businessman near the elevator who hadn't bothered lowering his voice. None of them had known his story. None of them had asked. They had simply looked at the surface of him and decided, in less time than it takes to order a coffee, exactly what he was worth. He could have felt bitter about that. Part of him, if he was honest, did. But mostly, he felt something quieter and more important than anger. He felt clarity. He thought about all the people he had met over the years who had nothing. Men at the shelter where he had once slept for 3 months, women he had seen turned away from jobs because of the way they were dressed, families he had watched struggle through winters without proper coats or enough food. He thought about how easily the world dismissed people simply because they hadn't yet had the chance to prove themselves. And he thought about how close he had come, so many times, to being dismissed permanently. Passed over, forgotten, judged by a room full of strangers who never once wondered what he had survived to be standing there at all. By the time the sun rose over the city, Daniel had already made his decision. The next morning, Daniel returned to the Ashford Grand. This time, he wore a simple black suit, not flashy, not designed to impress, just clean, well-fitted, and quietly confident. He didn't need anyone in that lobby to notice him. He had already decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of the night before, that he would never again let a room's opinion define how he carried himself. Richard was there, standing near the same spot he had been in the day before, deep in conversation with a hotel manager about an upcoming deal. He glanced up as Daniel walked in, and this time, there was no laugh, no smirk, no careless joke waiting on his lips. His face went pale. Thomas Harrison stood beside Daniel, and within minutes, word had already begun moving quietly through the lobby, through the hallways, through the small circles of powerful people who made their living paying close attention to exactly this kind of news. The man in the worn jacket was no longer just a man in a worn jacket. He was now the majority owner of the very company Richard had spent years trying to impress, court, and win favor with. Richard approached him slowly, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "Daniel," he said, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been the day before. "I didn't know." Daniel looked at him, calm and steady. "I know." Richard hesitated, glancing briefly at Thomas before looking back at Daniel. "I hope you don't take what happened yesterday personally." A small, quiet smile crossed Daniel's face, not triumphant, not cruel, just genuinely at peace. "No, Richard. I don't." Richard exhaled, some of the color returning to his face, relief settling in far too quickly. Then Daniel added, "But I learned something yesterday." Richard's shoulders tensed again. "What's that?" Daniel looked slowly around the lobby, at the chandeliers, the marble floors, the same faces that had whispered and laughed less than 24 hours earlier, now watching him with an entirely different kind of attention. "When people think you have nothing," Daniel said quietly, "they show you exactly who they really are." Richard lowered his head, and for the first time since Daniel had known him, he had nothing clever to say in return. Daniel could have destroyed him. With the resources he now had, with the leverage sitting quietly in his name, ruining Richard's career would have taken little more than a phone call. Part of him, briefly, considered it. But that wasn't the man his father had raised him to become. "I don't want revenge," Daniel said simply. "I want people to stop treating others like they're worthless just because of what they're wearing, or what they don't have yet." Richard nodded slowly, silently, and for the first time, it seemed like he actually understood. In the months that followed, Daniel used a significant portion of his father's fortune to build something his father never had the resources to create in his lifetime. A foundation dedicated to struggling families, unemployed workers, and homeless individuals across Chicago. He funded shelters. He created job training programs. He personally reviewed stories submitted by people asking for help, refusing to let the foundation become just another faceless organization handing out paperwork instead of second chances. He never forgot where he came from. He made sure of that, deliberately, the way a person protects something precious. And whenever someone, a reporter, an investor, a stranger at a charity dinner, asked him why a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars still wore simple, unremarkable clothes, still lived in a modest home, still drove an old, dependable car instead of something flashy, Daniel always gave the same quiet answer. "Because money changed my life," he would say, "but it never changed who I was." The people who had once mocked him in that lobby, the receptionist, the businessman by the elevator, even Richard himself, eventually came to understand the lesson buried inside that rainy afternoon. It wasn't really about money at all. It was about the danger of deciding, in an instant, who someone is based on nothing more than what they happen to be wearing that day. You never truly know the story behind someone else's struggle. And the person you look down on today may be the very person you need tomorrow, or, more importantly, the person who quietly teaches you how to be better than you were yesterday. That, in the end, was the fortune Daniel's father had really left him. Not the money. The lesson.